This is Blackwood Estate, a mansion packed with secrets, a massive inheritance on the line, and two total strangers who have to live here together for a year to keep it all. But they can't just survive the year. They have to uncover the mansion's hidden past, protect its legacy, and find a way to work together, or they lose everything. Will they conquer the ghosts of their pasts and save the estate? Or will their differences tear them and the inheritance apart? One thing's for sure. What they discover here will change everything. I'm your host, Josh, and it's an absolute pleasure to share this story with you. Ava Thompson never thought she'd step foot inside a mansion like this. The place was big enough to house a small country, with stained glass windows that told stories of ancient battles and chandeliers that could have doubled as giant disco balls. But here she was, standing in the middle of the grand entrance hall of Blackwood Estate, wondering how on earth she, a coffee shop manager with a very modest apartment and an aging Toyota, had ended up here. The answer was as strange as it was uncomfortable. A distant relative whom she'd met maybe once as a child had died. And apparently, this reclusive relative had been the proud owner of, well, everything around her. She was now the proud inheritor of a house straight out of a Ghosts of the Past thriller. But there was a catch. Oh, there's always a catch, right? She wasn't the only inheritor. Nope. Ava's new mansion and all the wealth that came with it could only be hers if she agreed to one tiny, absolutely minor detail, living here for a year, and not alone. Ridiculous, Ava muttered, rereading the lawyer's letter for the 100th time as if, somehow, it would magically change. Who thought this up? A prankster from the beyond. Just then, the front door creaked open, interrupting her private breakdown. She spun around, clutching the letter like it was a shield. In strode a man who was definitely not her idea of a roommate. He was tall, with a stiff expression that screamed, "I'm not here to make friends." Dark hair, dark coat, and eyes that looked like they'd seen things he'd rather forget. He stopped in his tracks when he saw her, raising one dark eyebrow in the universal language of, "Why are you here?" Ava braced herself. "You must be Lucas," she managed, forcing a polite smile. "Lucas Blackwell, right?" He gave her a single nod, his gaze sweeping over her with an air of assessment that made her feel like she'd shown up to a black tie event in sweatpants. "And you must be Ava," he replied, with a tone that suggested he'd rather be addressing anyone else on the planet. They stared at each other, a long, uncomfortable silence stretching between them. Ava cleared her throat, not liking the way Lucas seemed to be sizing her up like she was just another piece of furniture. "So, I guess we're in this together," she said, trying to sound casual. "You know, the whole two strangers forced to live in a creepy mansion to claim their inheritance scenario. It's kind of like a movie, don't you think?" He barely flinched. "I don't watch movies." Of course he didn't. Ava clenched her jaw and tried again. "All right, well, it looks like we both have a lot to figure out. So, ground rules?" Lucas's gaze narrowed slightly. "Ground rules?" "Yes," she said, as if it were obvious. "Like, I don't want you sneaking up on me in the middle of the night looking like you're auditioning for a horror film. And maybe no lurking in doorways?" Lucas's face remained impressively neutral. "I don't lurk." "Oh, right, you just silently appear," she shot back, immediately regretting the sarcasm. This wasn't exactly starting things off on the right foot. He looked away, hands sliding into his coat pockets. "Fine. Let's just keep to ourselves and get through the year." The way he said it, you'd think they'd been sentenced to prison together. Ava bit back the urge to ask what his deal was. But then again, she wasn't about to spill her life story to him either. Better they kept things simple. As they stood there, awkwardly silent, a faint tap sound echoed down the hall. Ava jumped, clutching the letter even tighter. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, barely breathing. Lucas rolled his eyes. "This house is over 100 years old. It's bound to creak. Maybe." But there was something about the way he said it that made Ava think he knew the place held more secrets than just squeaky floors. Ignoring the unsettling feeling gnawing at her, she squared her shoulders and glanced around. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-looking ancestors, watching over them with unblinking eyes. She could practically hear them judging her for her choice of jeans and old sweatshirt. "Do you know much about the family?" she asked, half hoping he'd let slip some history that might shed light on why her relative had dreamed up this twisted arrangement. Lucas just shrugged. "Only what I need to know. And that's that we both need this inheritance." Let's keep it professional and stay out of each other's way. Right. Professional. She could do that. But as she finally made her way to the wing that would be hers, a sinking feeling told her that keeping her distance from Lucas Blackwell was going to be harder than she thought. The house had an eerie way of pulling her attention to every shadow, every whisper of history embedded in its bones. She tried to shake it off, focusing instead on unpacking the few bags she'd brought. Night fell fast. Ava's room, despite its cavernous size and antique furnishings, felt strangely comforting, like a secret hideaway. She climbed into the massive four-poster bed, cocooned in soft blankets, hoping for some relief after the bizarre day. But as soon as she closed her eyes, every creak, every distant drip of water sounded like something, or someone, moving in the house. Just as she was beginning to drift off, a loud thud echoed down the hall, jerking her awake. Heart pounding, she crept out of bed, heading to the door with cautious steps. The mansion seemed to hold its breath with her, each step amplifying the silence. The noise had come from the hallway outside Lucas's room. She hesitated, not exactly thrilled to be wandering around in the middle of the night with a stranger nearby. But curiosity got the better of her. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly. No answer. After a pause, she knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. She braced herself, half expecting him to swing open the door in irritation. But all she got was silence. Ava let out a shaky breath. Ground rules, she muttered to herself. Maybe add no midnight ghost walking. She padded back to her room, determined to sleep despite the mansion's uncanny vibes. Tomorrow, she told herself, she'd start making sense of all this. The house, the history, the man who seemed to carry as many secrets as the place itself. She was here to survive a year with a stranger, nothing more. But as she closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the sense that she was about to uncover more than she'd bargained for. Ava woke to the soft morning light filtering through tall, arched windows, casting colorful patches on her walls like a stained glass kaleidoscope. Her first night at Blackwood Estate had been surreal, to say the least. And the man down the hall, her strange new roommate, only added to the eerie thrill that kept her on edge. Not that she'd admit any of that to Lucas Blackwell. As far as he was concerned, she was the unshakable heiress here for a routine inheritance. Ava dressed quickly, deciding she'd explore the kitchen and get a jump on breakfast before Lucas emerged from wherever he lurked. She crept down the wide wooden staircase, its steps giving the occasional creak, as if to remind her just how ancient this place was. The hallways, lined with portraits of her ancestors, most of whom seemed to be scowling at her, didn't do much to ease her nerves. Finally, she found the kitchen, tucked away at the back of the house. To her surprise, it wasn't the formal, Victorian-style setup she expected, but rather a modern, sleek kitchen that looked like it had been remodeled sometime in the last decade. Shiny appliances, granite counters, and even a coffee machine that looked like it might require a degree in engineering to operate. Ava figured out the basics, got the coffee brewing, and was just pouring herself a cup when she felt the prickling sensation of being watched. She turned to find Lucas leaning against the doorframe, watching her with a cool, unreadable expression. "Morning," she managed, trying to keep her tone neutral. He gave a barely there nod and made his way into the kitchen, grabbing a mug and helping himself to the coffee she'd made. He didn't say a word, just took his coffee black and leaned against the counter, seemingly content with the awkward silence. Fine, Ava thought. Two could play that game. She took her coffee to the large table in the center of the kitchen, sipping quietly, pretending to be utterly absorbed in the steam swirling up from her mug. But Lucas's presence felt as heavy as an iron weight, and she found herself hyper-aware of his every movement, the slight clink of his mug on the counter, the faint rustle of his shirt as he shifted. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably more like 3 minutes, Lucas broke the silence. "So, you plan on wandering around the place all day?" Ava blinked, taken aback by the question, and the slight challenge in his tone. "I didn't realize my plans were of any interest to you," she replied, aiming for polite but landing somewhere closer to defensive. "They're not," he said flatly. "Just trying to figure out if you're here for the money or the experience." "Oh, right," Ava replied, sarcasm coating her words. "Because people usually choose to live in creaky old mansions with strangers for the experience." A hint of a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, just enough to make Ava wonder if there was an actual person under that icy exterior. But he recovered quickly, face smoothing back into its usual guarded expression. "Fair enough. he said, taking another sip of coffee. Just try not to poke around too much. This place has its quirks. The way he said it sent a shiver down Ava's spine. Quirks? She asked, unable to mask the curiosity in her voice. He glanced at her, clearly debating whether to elaborate. You'll figure it out, he finally said, his tone dismissive. Then he set his empty mug down, nodded in her direction as a sort of goodbye, and walked out, leaving Ava alone in the eerily quiet kitchen. Quirks, she thought, rolling the word around in her mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. What was he hiding? Later that afternoon, Ava decided to explore the house, taking his comment as permission, or at least a lack of an outright ban. As she wandered through dusty hallways, her footsteps muffled by thick, faded carpets, she couldn't shake the feeling that Blackwood Estate was watching her. Each room held a different story, as though the walls themselves were heavy with secrets. She peeked into a formal sitting room filled with elaborate Victorian furniture, a sunroom lined with cracked but once beautiful stained glass, and a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves covered in a thin layer of dust. She stopped in front of an old, ornate door, curiosity bubbling inside her, until she finally gave in and nudged it open. The attic. Stepping inside, Ava felt as if she'd stumbled into the past. Antique trunks, dusty photo albums, and forgotten family relics lay scattered, waiting to be rediscovered. She walked carefully, the wooden beams creaking beneath her. In the far corner, she found a small, leather-bound journal on top of a trunk. She opened it slowly, her fingers brushing the brittle pages, which were filled with looping, elegant handwriting. Names, dates, and scattered thoughts hinted at a past she didn't know. A forbidden love affair, maybe? The phrases were vague, almost as if the writer was hiding something. Her heart beat a little faster as she realized this might be a piece of her family's history, a part of her inheritance she'd never expected. But before she could get further, a noise broke the silence, a soft creak behind her. She spun around to see Lucas standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and an eyebrow raised. "Didn't I tell you to be careful about poking around?" His voice was calm, but the faintest hint of a warning laced his words. Ava clutched the journal to her chest, as though it were a treasure. "I wasn't poking around. I was just getting to know my new home." He narrowed his eyes, taking a slow step forward. "There are things in this house that are better left in the past. If you want my advice, don't get too curious." Ava lifted her chin, unwilling to back down. "Is that a warning, or just your way of trying to keep all the mystery for yourself?" He held her gaze for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Ava alone in the attic, her mind buzzing with questions. As she stood there, clutching the journal and watching his shadow disappear down the stairs, Ava felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a deep, simmering curiosity mixed with a strange thrill. There was more to this mansion, more to Lucas Blackwell than met the eye, and she intended to find out exactly what it was. It was just past dusk when the sky over Blackwood Estate turned a brooding shade of gray. Ava watched the clouds gather from the library window, thick and menacing, darkening the world outside as though the house were preparing for something monumental. The rumble of distant thunder rolled through the mansion, vibrating the walls and rattling the old glass. She shivered involuntarily, pulling her cardigan a little tighter around herself. This storm didn't seem like a friendly one. No gentle patter of rain, no misty drizzle. It felt as if the universe itself was about to crack open. As she turned to go back to her room, the power went out. Just like that, the entire house plunged into darkness. Ava froze, every instinct screaming to stay where she was. But then the silence was shattered by a set of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside the library. She wasn't alone. A flashlight beam swept across the doorway, and a second later, Lucas appeared. His expression was as unreadable as always, though there was a slight furrow to his brow. "Power's out," he announced, as though she hadn't noticed. "Yeah, thanks. I figured that part out," Ava replied, clutching her phone tightly, wishing she'd charged it earlier. Her screen glowed faintly, but she knew it was on its last leg. She just hoped the power wouldn't be out for too long. Lucas held up an old-fashioned lantern, already lit, and gestured for her to follow. "There are some emergency supplies in the kitchen. You'll want a candle." He led the way down the long, shadowed hallways, the flickering light casting eerie shapes on the walls. Ava was too busy trying not to trip over her own feet to be nervous about the company, though she couldn't deny the strange comfort of having Lucas here, leading her through the darkness with a steady hand. In the kitchen, Lucas opened a cabinet and handed her a thick, stubby candle. He struck a match, lighting it for her, the tiny flame sparking to life in the dim room. She cradled it carefully, letting the warmth and light calm her nerves. "Guess we'll be playing the Pioneer game for a while," she said, forcing a small laugh. "Just you, me, and our trusty fire." Lucas's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Looks that way. I'd recommend staying out of the attic if you're scared of the dark." "Funny, I'll be fine," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. But a loud clap of thunder made her jump, and she quickly busied herself with adjusting the candle, hoping he didn't notice. After a moment of silence, she glanced at him, hoping to deflect the tension. "So, this house, you know it pretty well?" He shrugged, setting his own lantern down on the kitchen counter. "Well enough to know the roof leaks in 3 different places." "Practical knowledge," she replied, surprised by his dry humor. "Didn't figure you as the handyman type." Lucas gave her a sideways glance, that slight smirk reappearing. "There's a lot you don't know about me, Ava." She hesitated, his tone hinting at layers beneath that guarded exterior, and the curiosity she'd tried to ignore tugged at her once again. "True," she said softly. "Maybe someday you'll fill me in." "Doubtful," he replied. But there was no bite to his words this time. In fact, something about his expression had softened, just a little, as though he were considering the possibility. They lapsed into silence, listening to the storm rage outside, the flicker of candlelight dancing across their faces. Ava found herself feeling oddly at peace. Something about the glow of the candle and the quiet between them was almost comforting. She glanced up and caught Lucas looking at her, his gaze unreadable in the dim light. For a heartbeat, she wondered if he felt it too. The strange sense of connection, even though neither of them had spoken much. It was as if the storm outside had momentarily dissolved the walls between them, leaving only the flickering light and the shared silence. Just as she opened her mouth to say something, anything, to break the stillness, a massive crash of thunder shook the house. She gasped, her candle sputtering out. She reached for her phone out of habit, but it was no use. The battery had finally given up. She felt Lucas step closer, his hand brushing against hers as he handed her his lantern. "Here," he murmured, his voice softer now. "You can keep it until the lights come back on." Her fingers brushed his as she took it, the brief contact sending a jolt of warmth through her. She didn't know why she felt compelled to say something, but it seemed wrong to just let the silence stretch again. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, but he didn't step back. For a moment, they stood like that, close enough to feel each other's presence in the dim light. Ava felt her heart beat a little faster, caught off guard by the quiet intensity between them. Lucas, usually so distant and aloof, seemed different, less guarded maybe. She wanted to ask him why he was here, why he needed this inheritance as much as she did. But she held back, sensing he wasn't ready to answer. After a long moment, he cleared his throat and took a step back, reclaiming his usual composed demeanor. "I'll check the generator. It should kick in eventually." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving her standing alone with the lantern, the storm still roaring outside. Ava stood there for a few moments longer, feeling the chill settle back over her as the warmth of his presence faded. She made her way back to her room, wondering how one silent evening with Lucas could feel so significant. Maybe it was the house, maybe it was the storm, but something about him felt different tonight. She wasn't sure what it meant, or if it meant anything at all. But as she settled back under the blankets, she knew one thing. Lucas Blackwell wasn't just some stranger anymore. They were connected now, however thinly, and that realization lingered as the storm continued to rage outside, whispering secrets that only the darkness could keep. The next day, with the memory of the storm lingering in her mind, Ava found herself wandering back up to the attic. The house felt different in the early morning light, its age and secrets softened somehow by the sun filtering through dusty windows. She could still hear Lucas's words from the night before, his warning about the house's quirks echoing in her mind. And of course, now she was even more curious. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten things, a time capsule of lives lived long ago. Pushing aside cobwebs and stepping over old crates, Ava searched for anything that could give her a hint about her family's history. something to help explain why a total stranger like Lucas would be tied to this place. In a corner, she spotted the same trunk she'd come across during her last visit. Its brass edges were tarnished, and a heavy padlock hung from the latch. Only the padlock was broken, hanging open, as though someone had rifled through it long ago. Intrigued, she lifted the lid, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside was a stack of letters bound together with a faded red ribbon, yellowed pages filled with handwriting that looped and twisted like ivy on an ancient wall. Underneath the letters was a leather-bound journal. Ava hesitated, her fingers hovering over the delicate cover. A sense of reverence washed over her. This journal, whoever had written it, felt like an intimate relic, a piece of a life that was somehow connected to her own. Taking a breath, she opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant and careful, each line precisely measured as if the writer had taken time to weigh each word. The opening lines drew her in immediately, speaking of love and secrets, of forbidden meetings under the cover of night. As Ava flipped through the pages, she realized she was reading about an old love affair, one kept hidden from society, yet filled with passion and longing. Ava's heart quickened. Whoever had written this had been in love, but for reasons unclear, they'd kept it hidden from the world. She imagined a young woman, maybe even an ancestor, sneaking out under the same dark sky that now loomed over Blackwood Estate, meeting someone who had become her secret sanctuary. Suddenly, the journal was snatched from her hands. She gasped, spinning around to find Lucas standing behind her, his jaw tight and his expression cold. He held the journal in one hand, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at her. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, but with an edge that sent a shiver down her spine. Ava straightened, feeling a flash of defensiveness. "I'm learning about my family. Isn't that what I'm supposed to do here?" Lucas glanced at the open trunk, his face shadowed. "Some things are better left in the past. Trust me on that." She crossed her arms, refusing to back down. "Why do you care what I find? This is my inheritance too." He took a step closer, and Ava could feel the intensity radiating off him. "This journal isn't just old gossip. It's part of a history that's complicated, one that might be more than you're ready for." Ava's eyes narrowed, suspicion stirring in her. "What are you hiding?" His gaze met hers, and for a moment, she thought he might actually tell her. But then he shook his head, carefully closing the journal and setting it back in the trunk. "Some questions don't have answers, Ava. Not the ones you want, anyway." He started to walk away, leaving her standing there in frustration. But just as he reached the doorway, she couldn't resist one last jab. "Do you know what's in that journal, Lucas? Do you know the secrets?" He stopped, his back to her. "I know enough." And then he disappeared down the stairs, leaving Ava alone with more questions than answers. Fils Saint-Ar. After that tense encounter, she spent the rest of the day in a fog of unanswered curiosity, the journal's whispered secrets haunting her thoughts. Who had written it? And why was Lucas so intent on keeping it, and its secrets, hidden? That evening, while making tea in the kitchen, she caught sight of him in the study, leafing through an old book with a pensive expression. She hesitated in the doorway, watching him, trying to make sense of the enigma that was Lucas Blackwell. He looked almost haunted, as though he were battling something unseen. Ava stepped into the room, unable to ignore the pull of her curiosity. "Lucas, about the journal. What's the big deal? If there's something I should know." His eyes flashed as he looked up, but this time, there was something else in them, something raw and almost vulnerable. "Just let it go, Ava. This place has a way of making things darker than they need to be." She shook her head, frustrated by his evasiveness. "But you're here too. You could help me understand all this instead of just brooding in the corner." Lucas's gaze softened, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "It's not that simple." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Look, this house, it has a way of holding on to things, even things we'd rather forget. The people who lived here, some of them were broken by it. Just be careful what you dig up." With that, he rose and walked past her, leaving her alone in the study with her thoughts. The house was quiet now, almost watchful, as though waiting for her next move. Ava stood there, staring after him, torn between the urge to pry open the secrets of Blackwood Estate and the unsettling warning he'd left her with. What could be so dangerous about her own family's past? And why did Lucas, a man she barely knew, care so much about keeping it hidden? One thing was certain. She wasn't letting this go. Not until she uncovered the truth. Ava tried to ignore Lucas's warning. Really, she did. But Blackwood Estate was a living puzzle, its secrets spilling out into every dusty room and shadowed corridor. The journal, the hidden love affair, the way Lucas watched her as if he was the one guarding these mysteries. It was all too much to resist. So she went back to the attic, determined to dig deeper. She opened the journal again, her eyes scanning the delicate handwriting as it spoke of longing glances, secret meetings, and promises never kept. Whoever had written this journal had been in love, passionately, recklessly, and had risked everything for it. Ava couldn't help but wonder if her ancestor had ever regretted it. Footsteps creaked behind her. Back at it again, I see. Lucas's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. Ava turned to find him standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and his gaze intense. She braced herself. I thought we agreed to stay out of each other's way. He raised an eyebrow. I said to be careful, but it seems you don't take advice. Ava stood her ground. Maybe because your advice makes no sense. You're acting like this place is a minefield. It's a house, Lucas. Just a house. He stepped closer, his expression darkening. Maybe that's all it is to you. But some of us actually understand what's at stake here. What's that supposed to mean? She shot back, anger sparking in her chest. I'm trying to understand my own family's past. And all you do is sulk around, acting like I don't belong here. Maybe you don't, he replied coolly. Ava clenched her fists. She could feel her patience slipping, her desire to keep things civil falling apart. You're hiding something. I can see it. And the only reason you'd want to keep me in the dark is if you're the one who doesn't belong here. Lucas's eyes narrowed. You think I'm here for the money? The accusation hung in the air, thick and sharp. Ava knew it wasn't fair. She barely knew him, barely understood his motivations. But in that moment, her frustration, her curiosity, and her anger boiled over, and the words slipped out before she could stop them. Well, why else would you be here? She demanded. You seem to hate this place, and yet you're clinging to it, warning me off like you're some kind of guardian. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking as he struggled to contain his anger. Believe what you want, he said, his voice low and cold. But don't pretend you're any different. We're both here for the same reason. Money. The words stung, hitting a little too close to the truth. Ava felt her cheeks flush with anger and shame. She wanted to argue, to tell him that she was here to understand her family, that the inheritance was a means to an end, nothing more. But she couldn't deny that the money mattered, that it would change her life, solve problems she'd been carrying for years. Lucas saw the hesitation in her face, and his gaze softened for just a moment, as if he understood. Then his face hardened again, and he turned to leave. You're right about one thing, Ava, he said over his shoulder. This place is a minefield, and you're walking straight into it. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone in the dusty, silent attic with the journal clutched in her hands and a knot of frustration and confusion tightening in her chest. For the rest of the day passed in a blur of anger and brooding silence. Ava paced her room, replaying the argument over and over, his words digging into her like barbed wire. She hated that he could get under her skin so easily, hated that he seemed to know exactly how to push her buttons. But more than anything, she hated that he was right. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered back to the library. The house felt different in the dark, its shadows stretching longer, deeper, almost as if they were alive. Ava's footsteps echoed as she made her way down the hall, her anger slowly giving way to an eerie sense of calm. She found herself in front of a painting, one she hadn't noticed before. It was a portrait of a woman, beautiful and solemn, her eyes gazing off into the distance with an expression Ava couldn't quite place. Hope, maybe, or heartbreak. The plaque below the painting read, Margaret Blackwood, 1893. Margaret Blackwood, the name from the journal. Ava reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame, and a strange sensation washed over her, almost like a whisper, a breath from a memory long forgotten. Couldn't stay away, could you? She spun around to find Lucas standing in the doorway, his face half-shadowed. There was no anger in his eyes this time, only a quiet resignation, as if he'd been expecting her here all along. Margaret Blackwood, Ava said, ignoring the flutter in her chest. She's the one who wrote the journal, isn't she? He nodded slowly. She was a part of this house, and she left pieces of herself behind. Ava looked back at the painting, at the woman who'd poured her heart into that journal. What happened to her? Lucas's gaze darkened, his eyes distant. She lost herself in this place. It took everything from her. The weight of his words settled over them, thick and heavy. Ava shivered, suddenly understanding his warning, his reluctance to share the secrets of Blackwood Estate. "Is that what you're afraid of?" she asked softly. "That I'll end up like her?" For a moment he didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the portrait. Then he looked at her, something raw and unguarded in his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." The words settled into her like stones, heavy and unyielding. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to reassure him when she didn't even understand her own connection to this place. But as they stood there, side by side in the darkened hall, Ava felt a fragile thread of understanding between them. Something that, for the first time, felt like a connection rather than a rivalry. The silence stretched, neither of them willing to break the moment. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Ava felt like she was beginning to see the real Lucas Blackwell. A man haunted by the same past that now loomed over her, tangled in secrets he couldn't let go of. Finally, Lucas turned to leave, his face slipping back into its usual guarded expression. But before he disappeared into the shadows, he paused, glancing back at her with a look that almost seemed like an invitation. "Good night, Ava," he murmured, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. And then he was gone, leaving her alone with the flickering shadows, the ghostly portrait of Margaret Blackwood, and a deep, unsettling question she couldn't shake. Was she truly ready to face the secrets of this house? Or was she already in too deep? Ava awoke the next morning with one thought fixed in her mind. She had to understand Lucas. Their exchange the night before, his warning, the unguarded fear in his eyes, had left her restless. For someone so adamant about guarding secrets, Lucas had moments when his emotions flickered through, like sunlight slipping between clouds. And now, more than ever, she wanted to know the person beneath the stoic exterior. She wandered down to the library, hoping a quiet morning might clear her thoughts. But as she stepped inside, her eyes fell on a photograph lying open on the desk, the faded black and white image of a woman with a gentle smile. She looked strikingly familiar, her features bearing a faint resemblance to Lucas's. Ava leaned in, studying the image, when a deep voice spoke from behind her. "Don't touch that." She whipped around to see Lucas standing in the doorway, his face shadowed, his expression cold and hard. He didn't move, but his eyes were fixed on the photograph with an intensity she hadn't seen before. Ava quickly pulled her hand back, guilt prickling her skin. I didn't mean to pry. She looked familiar. He stepped forward, taking the photograph and holding it with a tenderness that surprised her. "She's my mother," he said quietly, the words heavy with something unspoken. "She lived here once, long ago." Ava blinked, caught off guard by the rawness in his voice. "I didn't know you had family who lived here." Lucas's gaze remained on the photo, his expression unreadable. "I don't talk about her." There was a finality in his tone, but Ava couldn't stop herself. "Did she leave then? Is that why you're here now?" He hesitated, his face tightening as if he were fighting an inner battle. "No," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She didn't leave. This house took her, just like it took Margaret Blackwood, and I won't let it take anyone else." Ava felt a pang in her chest, her curiosity overshadowed by something deeper. Compassion, maybe, or the sting of understanding. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of the memories that clearly haunted him. For the first time, Lucas didn't look distant or untouchable. He looked human, vulnerable. Gently, she reached out, resting a hand on his arm. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't know." He flinched at the touch, but didn't pull away. "You couldn't have known. But that's why I tried to warn you. This place, it's not just an inheritance, Ava. It's a prison, a weight that binds people to its history." Ava swallowed, the walls of the mansion feeling closer now, as though they were listening. She thought back to the journal, to the love affair recorded in those pages, and to the eerie presence that seemed to seep through every shadowed hallway and creaking floorboard. Maybe Lucas was right. Maybe this place really did carry some kind of curse. "But it's not a curse for you," she murmured, her gaze searching his. "You could just walk away. You don't have to be here, Lucas. Why stay? He closed his eyes, a look of pain flickering across his face. Because I have nowhere else to go. The words hung between them, stark and unguarded. Ava felt her heart twist, and she resisted the urge to pull him into a hug. Instead, she stayed close, letting him feel her presence, her support. She didn't need to ask any more questions. His silence spoke louder than words. After a long moment, he turned away, setting the photograph back on the desk with gentle hands, as if placing a piece of himself down with it. I should get back to work, he said, his voice returning to its usual guarded tone. But before he could leave, Ava stepped forward. Lucas, wait. He paused, looking at her with a wariness that almost made her falter, but she forced herself to continue. If this place is such a prison, then why don't we change it? She asked. Together. We don't have to let it keep us here. We can make it ours. For a moment, Lucas stared at her, his gaze unreadable. Then, slowly, a glimmer of something softened his expression. A hint of hope, maybe, or the faintest trace of a smile. We'll see, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. We'll see. The rest of the day passed in a quieter rhythm. Ava couldn't shake the memory of Lucas's confession, his words looping in her mind as she moved through the house. She found herself lingering in the rooms, her fingers tracing the faded wallpaper and worn furniture, feeling connected to the people who had once called this place home. That evening, as she sat in the library reading by lamplight, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Lucas standing in the doorway, his expression softer than usual. Without a word, he crossed the room and sat down across from her, pulling a book off the shelf and opening it as though he'd done it 100 times before. They read in comfortable silence, the flicker of the lamplight casting warm shadows around them. Ava found herself stealing glances at him, a faint warmth spreading in her chest as she realized how natural this felt. Two people, sharing the quiet, simply existing together. At one point, Lucas glanced up, catching her gaze. She quickly looked back at her book, feeling her cheeks flush. But when she dared to look up again, she found him smiling faintly, a look in his eyes that hinted at something soft and unspoken. For the first time, Ava felt like she was starting to understand him. This guarded, haunted man who had built walls around himself was slowly, cautiously, letting her in. And though they had only begun to uncover the mysteries of Blackwood Estate, she sensed that they were on the brink of something even more profound, a connection that had the power to either bind them or set them both free. And as the house settled around them, quiet and watchful, Ava felt a surge of determination rise within her. She wasn't giving up on this place, not on its secrets, not on its history, and certainly not on Lucas. Whatever it took, she was ready to face the darkness with him, even if it meant losing herself along the way. Days at Blackwood Estate started to blend into a quiet routine. Each morning, Ava would make her way down to the kitchen, usually finding Lucas already there, sipping his coffee in contemplative silence. They'd exchange brief nods, an acknowledgement of each other's presence that had become oddly comforting. Without realizing it, they'd fallen into a pattern. Ava would explore a room, cataloging the house's strange little quirks and quirking her own memories to match. And at some point, Lucas would find his way to where she was, pretending not to be curious about what she was up to, and lending a silent hand with whatever she was doing. One morning, Ava found herself in the overgrown garden, struggling to clear away a stubborn tangle of ivy that had swallowed one of the old statues. The figure beneath the ivy was a faded marble angel, its face solemn and weathered. The vines were so thick it was hard to make out the angel's features. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear Lucas approach until his shadow fell over her. She glanced up, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "You trying to unearth a relic?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of humor. "Something like that," she replied, tugging at a particularly stubborn vine. "If I'm going to live here, I want to know what I'm living with." He watched her for a moment, then moved beside her, grabbing hold of a thick branch of ivy and yanking it free. They worked in silence, their movements falling into an easy rhythm, and Ava found herself strangely at peace. As they cleared away the last of the vines, the statue's face emerged, softened by age, but still exuding a sense of quiet grace. Ava brushed a hand over the marble cheek, feeling an odd sense of kinship with the stone figure. Lucas straightened, crossing his arms as he studied the statue. You'd think this place was built to outlast all of us. She glanced at him, catching a note of weariness in his expression. Maybe that's what makes it worth saving. If it can survive all these years, maybe we can too. Lucas looked at her, something thoughtful in his gaze. You think we're here to save this place? Ava shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. I don't know, but I think maybe it's here to save us. They stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Lucas turned, his expression unreadable. Well, if that's the case, maybe we should give it a fighting chance. As the days passed, small gestures of care and companionship began to replace the tension between them. When Ava discovered a leak in the library ceiling during a rainstorm, Lucas appeared with tools in hand, patching it up with a quiet competence that made her appreciate his presence in ways she hadn't before. They started sharing dinners too, pulling together whatever supplies they could find in the house. One evening, they were making spaghetti, the scent of garlic and tomatoes filling the kitchen, when Ava accidentally splattered sauce on herself. She winced, looking down at the bright red stain on her shirt. Perfect, she muttered. Now I look like a Jackson Pollock painting. Lucas let out a rare laugh, his face lighting up in a way she'd never seen before. Maybe it's an improvement, he teased, his voice warm and amused. Ava stuck her tongue out at him, unable to hide her own smile. Very funny, Mr. Blackwell. For a moment, the air between them softened, and Ava felt an urge to reach out, to brush her fingers against his arm, or even just share the warmth of his laughter. But she held back, sensing that this fragile truce was something precious, something she didn't want to ruin by pushing too far, too fast. That night, as they lingered in the library, Lucas surprised her by pulling out a bottle of aged bourbon he'd found in one of the dusty cupboards. They poured small glasses, the amber liquid glowing in the lamplight, and settled into opposite armchairs by the fire. So, Ava ventured, swirling her glass, what do you think this place really holds? Lucas glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the shelves lined with old books and artifacts. History, he replied. Memories. Things left behind by people who probably wanted to forget them. Ava took a sip, savoring the warmth of the bourbon. And yet, here we are, trying to make sense of it all. He met her gaze, his eyes softened by the firelight. Maybe that's why we're here, to figure out what to keep and what to let go. She felt a surge of warmth, not from the bourbon, but from the gentle understanding in his eyes. Lucas, for all his guarded walls, seemed to share her desire to make something meaningful out of this place. In his own quiet way, he was searching for the same answers she was, facing the same fears. As they sat in silence, the weight of their shared journey settling between them, Ava realized that something had changed. Lucas was no longer just a stranger sharing her inheritance. He was her partner in unraveling the mysteries of Blackwood Estate. They were no longer two people bound by obligation, but two souls linked by something deeper, something unspoken, yet undeniable. She finished her drink, setting the glass on the table, and leaned back with a sigh. You know, this isn't exactly how I imagined spending a year, she said with a small smile. He raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing on his lips. And what did you imagine? Oh, you know, she replied, leaning into the playfulness of the moment. Maybe a beach? A villa? A cocktail that doesn't taste like fire? He chuckled, his eyes twinkling with amusement. So basically, anywhere but here. She grinned, feeling a lightness that had been missing since she'd arrived. Exactly. They shared a laugh, the sound filling the library like music, warming the room in a way that even the fire couldn't. Ava felt the distance between them shrink, the shared laughter weaving an invisible thread that bound them closer. Finally, as the fire died down and the library grew quiet, Ava stood, a hint of reluctance in her movements. I should get some sleep. Lucas nodded, his gaze lingering on her as she moved toward the door. Good night, Ava. She turned, meeting his eyes, and for a moment, she felt a spark pass between them, subtle yet undeniable, a promise of something waiting to unfold. Good night, Lucas, she whispered, her voice softer than she'd intended. As she left the library, the warmth of his gaze followed her, filling her with a strange and thrilling sense of possibility. She didn't know what the future held for them, but one thing was clear. Blackwood Estate was no longer just a house. It was becoming a home. And Lucas, despite all his shadows and secrets, was becoming something more. Ava was lost in a quiet morning, savoring the stillness of Blackwood Estate, when the rumble of tires crunching over gravel shattered the calm. She glanced out the window to see a sleek black car parked near the front steps, a rare sight in their isolated world. She felt a twinge of anxiety as a man stepped out, impeccably dressed in a suit and carrying a sleek leather briefcase. His stride was brisk, purposeful, like he was about to deliver news that demanded attention. Lucas joined her at the window, his face darkening. "Expecting someone?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. She shook her head. "No one I know." Together, they walked to the front door, exchanging uneasy glances before opening it to meet their unexpected guest. The man greeted them with a polite nod, extending a hand. "Good morning. Ava Thompson. Lucas Blackwell?" he asked crisply, his tone all business. Ava nodded, her pulse quickening. "Yes, that's us. I'm Mr. Townsend, the legal executor handling the Blackwood Estate," he said, his tone as polished as his suit. "There are some additional conditions regarding your inheritance that need clarification." Ava's stomach dropped. Conditions? She hadn't expected any more surprises, not after everything they'd already been through. Lucas shifted beside her, his jaw tightening. "Conditions?" she repeated, a wary edge to her voice. Mr. Townsend opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick document bound with red tape. He adjusted his glasses and glanced up at them, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said. "As you know, your benefactor stipulated that you both must reside at Blackwood Estate for 1 full year to receive the inheritance. However, there is an additional requirement, one that affects whether the inheritance is finalized." Ava felt her stomach twist, an unspoken fear settling in. "And what is that requirement?" Mr. Townsend's gaze flickered between them. "In addition to maintaining residence, you must demonstrate what the terms call unity of purpose over the course of the year. In other words, you're required to work together in restoring and preserving the estate as a single, unified property." Lucas let out a disbelieving laugh, though his eyes flashed with something darker. "So we're being tested? We're here to play house for someone's approval?" Mr. Townsend's face remained impassive. "It may seem unusual, but your benefactor was quite clear. If at any point you both fail to uphold the property's historical integrity or fail to act in agreement, the inheritance becomes forfeit. The estate would then revert to a trust to be managed by the Historical Society." Ava's mind spun. The idea that her benefactor had planned this entire setup, a forced coexistence, a test of their compatibility and shared purpose, felt strange and manipulative. But now, that inheritance wasn't just bound to time. It was tied to the delicate balance she and Lucas had been trying to find. She glanced at Lucas, who looked as if he were holding back a storm of frustration. "So, what exactly does unity of purpose mean?" she asked, her voice tight. "Do we have to agree on every little thing?" Mr. Townsend gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. "It means you must demonstrate an ongoing commitment to the estate's preservation and to each other's shared intentions. In essence, you must work together to care for Blackwood Estate and ensure it remains intact for future generations." Lucas's fists clenched at his sides. "And if we disagree? If one of us wants to take a different path? Then the inheritance would be lost," Mr. Townsend replied simply. The weight of those words settled heavily over them. Ava's heart raced as she considered the implications. It wasn't just about living here anymore. They had to share a purpose, a vision, and in a place that seemed designed to test them at every turn, that felt like a near impossible task. A long silence stretched between them. Lucas's gaze burned as he looked at her, frustration and anger simmering beneath the surface. "So, that's it then? We're puppets in some twisted family legacy?" Mr. Townsend glanced between them, then began packing up his briefcase. "I'll leave the documents for your review. I suggest you consider the terms carefully. The legacy your benefactor left is, without a doubt, valuable, but only if you're both able to honor their intentions." With that, he nodded politely, turned on his heel, and left them standing in stunned silence. After Mr. Townsend's departure, the house felt colder, as though the walls themselves were watching, waiting to see how they would handle this new complication. Lucas turned to her, his expression tense. "Well, isn't that just perfect? Now we have to agree on everything or risk losing it all." Ava's frustration bubbled up. her patience worn thin by his constant resistance. "Look, I didn't ask for this either, Lucas. But maybe we should stop treating this inheritance like a prison sentence and start working together." He gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Easy for you to say. You came into this with nothing to lose." Ava's cheeks flushed, a surge of anger rising in her. "Nothing to lose? Are you serious? I might not have a family legacy, but that doesn't mean I don't care about this place. I'm here, aren't I? I'm trying." "And what, you think that's enough?" he shot back, his voice rising. "This place isn't some playground for curiosity. You don't know what it means to be bound to it, to watch it consume people." Ava took a step back, his words striking a nerve. She could feel the anger radiating from him. But beneath that, she sensed fear. Fear of something he hadn't yet shared. "Then help me understand, Lucas," she said, her voice softer. "Instead of fighting me, help me see what this place means to you." He looked at her, his expression wavering, and for a moment, she thought he might finally let her in. But then he shook his head, his face hardening again. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered, turning away. Ava's heart sank as she watched him walk off, feeling the fragile connection between them slipping. She'd come here searching for answers, for family ties and history. But now, the weight of the inheritance felt heavier, darker, as if it carried the scars of everyone who had come before her. As the silence settled back over Blackwood Estate, Ava felt a chill run through her, a sense that she was standing at a crossroads. This place, this inheritance, it was asking more of her than she'd ever expected. And now, she had a choice to make. She could walk away, abandon the legacy, or she could stay, risking her heart and her future on the slim chance that she and Lucas could find common ground. But one thing was clear. If they were going to make it through this, she would have to find a way to break through Lucas's walls, for both their sakes. Ava paced the halls of Blackwood Estate, her mind buzzing with everything Mr. Townsend had told them. Unity of purpose. The phrase felt like a haunting refrain, echoing in every corner of the house. Whoever had set these terms wanted more than just two people coexisting. They wanted trust, commitment, maybe even love. She stopped short, shaking her head at the thought. No, that was impossible. But the more she thought about it, the more she couldn't ignore the truth. This wasn't just about preserving an estate. It was about creating a legacy, and she couldn't do that alone. Her thoughts kept circling back to Lucas. Every moment they'd shared, every argument, every stolen glance, every quiet evening by the fire, had woven a thread between them, binding them to each other and to this place. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about her or Lucas, or even the inheritance. This was about something bigger, something that had been waiting patiently for the right people to bring it to life, determined to finally confront the tension that had been simmering between them. Ava made her way to Lucas's room, her heart pounding with each step. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, but she knew she couldn't let this moment slip by. They had to try, even if it meant risking everything. When she reached his door, she took a deep breath and knocked. Lucas opened it, his expression guarded but curious. He looked tired, as though he'd been wrestling with his own thoughts just as much as she had. "Ava," he said, his voice soft. "What's going on?" She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "We need to talk. Really talk. About us. About this place. About what we're going to do." He hesitated, glancing down the hall as if he were considering bolting. But finally, he stepped aside, letting her in. She crossed the threshold, the weight of the moment settling over her as she looked around the room. His belongings were sparse. A stack of books, a few personal items, all carefully arranged. It struck her as both meticulously controlled and deeply lonely. Lucas gestured for her to sit, then leaned against the edge of the dresser, crossing his arms. "So, what do you want to say?" Ava swallowed, feeling 1,000 unspoken words press against her chest. "I want to know what this place means to you, Lucas. And I want to know if we're in this together." He looked at her, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite read. Hesitation, maybe, or hope. "Why does it matter to you?" "Because I care about this place. And because I care about you." The words slipped out, vulnerable and raw, and she didn't try to take them back. She'd come this far. She had to see it through. Lucas's expression softened, his guard slipping as he took a step closer. "Ava, I didn't expect any of this. When I came here, I thought I was going to live out this year and leave with my share of the inheritance. I didn't think I'd feel anything for you, or for this place." She took a step toward him, the distance between them shrinking as the truth settled into the space between them. "I know this wasn't what either of us planned, but maybe this place, this inheritance, it's here to give us a second chance." Lucas's gaze held hers, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through his guarded exterior. "What if we fail, Ava? What if we try to make this work, and it all falls apart?" Ava reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his. "Then at least we tried. But I believe we're here for a reason. Maybe this place needs us as much as we need it." For a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, slowly, he took her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers, warm and steady. She felt the weight of his touch, the quiet promise in it, and knew that they were both ready to take this leap together. They spent the rest of the evening talking, their conversation weaving through memories, dreams, fears. For the first time, Ava learned about Lucas's past, his family's troubled history with Blackwood Estate, the way the house had haunted him even before he'd set foot inside it. He spoke of his mother, the woman in the photograph, and how she'd always dreamed of restoring the estate, of breathing life back into its walls. But when tragedy struck, that dream had died with her. "That's why I stayed away," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't want to see this place become just another memory, another thing I couldn't save." Ava squeezed his hand, understanding his pain. "But it doesn't have to be that way. We can make this place something more, something that honors everyone who came before us." Lucas's gaze softened, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You really believe that?" She nodded, her heart swelling with conviction. "I do, and I think we're meant to do this together." As the fire crackled in the background, casting a warm glow over the room, Lucas leaned closer, his eyes searching hers. "Ava, I don't know what the future holds, but I'm willing to try. For you, for us, and for this place." Ava's breath caught as he reached up, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering, tender. She felt a thrill race through her, a spark that had been waiting to ignite since the moment they'd met. She reached for him, their fingers interlacing, their connection as steady as the foundation of the estate itself. And as he drew her into a gentle, heartfelt kiss, Ava knew they were finally ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together they would reclaim Blackwood Estate, not as a relic of the past, but as a legacy of love, resilience, and unity. The next morning, Ava woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She and Lucas moved through the house like they were breathing life into its bones, discussing repairs, dreaming up ways to restore its beauty. They were no longer two strangers. They were partners, bound by a shared vision, a unity of purpose that resonated in every step they took. And as they stood in the garden that evening, looking out over the estate, Ava felt the weight of the past lift. Blackwood Estate was no longer just a house. It was home, a symbol of the love they had found in each other, a place where memories and dreams intertwined. Lucas wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close, his warmth a steady anchor. "So," he murmured, his voice soft and full of wonder, "what do you think? Are we up for this?" Ava smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder, her heart full. "Absolutely," she whispered. "We're exactly where we're meant to be." They stood there in peaceful silence, the future bright and open before them, knowing that whatever challenges came their way, they would face them side by side. Together, they would rewrite the story of Blackwood Estate, creating a legacy not just of wealth or inheritance, but of love and commitment that would stand the test of time. Ava could hardly believe how much had changed in just a few short weeks. Blackwood Estate no longer felt like a burden or a test. It was now a symbol of something powerful, a promise of everything she and Lucas had built together. They had come here as strangers, but somehow, against all odds, this place had brought them closer than she could have ever imagined. She found herself spending each day with Lucas, working together to restore the house. It was no longer about meeting the inheritance's conditions. It was about building a future that honored the past without being trapped by it. Every corner of the house felt different, as if it had absorbed their shared laughter, their whispered dreams, their late-night talks by the fire. One morning, As Ava was wiping dust off a stack of old books in the library, she heard Lucas's footsteps behind her. She turned to see him holding a small, velvet-covered box. She raised an eyebrow, giving him a playful smile. "What's this?" "An official invitation," he replied, his voice tinged with amusement. "To a very exclusive event." Curious, Ava opened the box to find a simple but beautiful locket, its surface engraved with the image of Blackwood Estate. She ran her fingers over it, her heart swelling. "Lucas, it's beautiful. It belonged to my mother," he said softly, his gaze warm. "She loved this place, and I think she would have been thrilled to see what we're doing here." Ava looked up, touched by his openness. "Thank you, Lucas. I'll treasure it." They shared a tender smile, an unspoken bond strengthening between them. She fastened the locket around her neck, feeling its comforting weight against her heart. But that evening, as they finished dinner, Ava caught Lucas's hand, pulling him toward the garden. It was a crisp night, the stars bright overhead, and the garden looked almost magical under the moonlight. She led him to the center of the garden, where they had spent so many hours clearing vines and restoring overgrown paths. "Look around," she said, gesturing to the estate. "This is our legacy, Lucas. Not just the walls and windows, but everything we've put into it. The love, the laughter, the memories." He nodded, a quiet contentment in his gaze as he looked over their work. "It's strange," he murmured. "I never thought this place could feel like home. But with you, it does." They stood there in silence, taking in the estate that had once felt so intimidating and isolating, now transformed into a sanctuary filled with love and meaning. They had unlocked its mysteries, and in doing so, they had found each other. Ava slipped her hand into his, leaning into him. "I think we're ready for whatever comes next." The days that followed were filled with planning and projects as they put the finishing touches on their renovations. They contacted preservation experts, learning how to best protect the estate's historical features while making it comfortable and welcoming. They decided to open part of the mansion to the community, offering history tours and cultural events to honor its legacy. With each new step, Ava felt more confident in their vision. This wasn't just a restoration, it was a rebirth. They were transforming Blackwood Estate into a living memory, a place that honored the past while embracing the future. One afternoon, as they were setting up the old ballroom for an upcoming event, Ava glanced at Lucas, a mischievous smile tugging at her lips. "Dance with me." He looked surprised, then smiled, taking her hand as they moved to the center of the ballroom. They swayed together, their movements slow and unhurried, as if the world around them had faded away. Ava's head rested against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. They were quiet, no words needed. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over the ballroom, Ava felt a profound sense of peace. They had come to this house as two people with broken pieces, but together they had built something whole. Lucas pulled her closer, his voice a low murmur. "Thank you, Ava, for believing in this place, in us." She looked up, her eyes shining. "Thank you for letting me in." They shared a tender kiss, the house around them bearing witness to the promise that had grown between them. They had created a legacy bound not by wealth or obligation, but by a love that would echo through the halls long after they were gone. In the years that followed, Blackwood Estate became a place of life and laughter, a gathering spot for friends and community, a sanctuary for history lovers and dreamers. Ava and Lucas welcomed visitors from all over, sharing the stories and secrets of the mansion, watching as it continued to evolve with each new visitor who left a piece of themselves behind. And as the seasons turned, Ava often found herself wandering through the gardens with a quiet smile, feeling the spirit of the house surrounding her, comforting her, reminding her of all she and Lucas had built together. They hadn't just inherited a fortune. They had inherited a legacy, a story that would carry on through every person who stepped foot in Blackwood Estate. And in the end, Ava knew that was worth more than any inheritance. With Lucas by her side, she had found her true home, a place filled with memories, love, and the promise of a future they would face, side by side, forever. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription will show that I'm on the right path to bring you the best videos ever. Check this video out too. What if you inherited a mysterious lake house from a grandfather you never knew, only to find out it was promised to someone else?